Hey Adventures, so today is going to be a book review for a book that I've wanted to do a review for since I first read it a couple of years ago now. This is really exciting for me. This is going to be a fun one. So this is a review for Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw. Of course, I've already read this and reread it once, and then we had our discussion about it, which I'll have linked up in that corner, I believe it is. And just this book I've really enjoyed and I've talked a lot about, but I've never done a review. I did also a why you should read that I can also link up there, but those two videos, the reason why I did a why you should read, you know what, I think I get into this with what I have written, so I'll pause there and finish the introduction real quick. So this is Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw. This is a high fantasy, it's also a Christian fantasy, but there's also, it plays with a lot of tropes like adventure, coming of age, a quest, as well as a school setting. So there's a lot of different, plus many more, but there's a lot of different elements and tropes that are used in this that I really intend to enjoy. So let's get into the review now. This book I've never done a review for, as I already mentioned. I read it for the first time in 2020 and absolutely loved it. And back in June of 2022, so this year, I reread it and the experience was very much the same. Easily one of my favorite fantasy books I've ever read. And the fact that it's also a debut novel for Jonathan Renshaw is just incredible. So it's a debut novel, epic fantasy, and it's self-published all in one, and it's so good. And there's a lot of great self-published fantasy at this point, but this one is easily one of my favorites that I've read. Last year I did a why you should read, which as I mentioned will be linked up in the cards, and that was supposed to be a review. But by the time I sat down and started writing the review, I realized, oh wait, I don't remember enough about it to do a review on it, so I instead swapped and started writing a why you should read video for this one. Now that it's a much more recent read, and I still love it just as much, I figured it would be a perfect time to actually do a review for it. Plus I've started doing a review for pretty much every book that I read. So this read through, instead of reading physically, I decided to listen to it on audiobook. What happened was I was planning to read it physically, but then I bought the audiobook so that Kate would have it to listen to if she wanted to, but then I also wasn't having a ton of time to physically read and I needed to get through that book, and it's a 705-page book or something like that, and so I decided, okay, I'll listen to the audiobook and then I'll read physically when I get a chance to read physically, but then I didn't get a chance to read physically before I finished the book, so I just listened to the entire audiobook, and it was really good. I didn't love the narrator at first. When it first started, his narration didn't quite work for me, and it just wasn't quite fitting the world. But as the story continued and as he got a little bit more comfortable with the narration of that specific story, and as I got more comfortable with him, all the things came together, and the execution of this audiobook was really well done. When I look at a book, I usually end up focusing on what I call my 5 elements of story. So those are 5 big parts of story that are the most important 5 things to me. That would be character, plot, themes, world or setting, and then the uniqueness factor, which used to be what I used to just call that a magic system, but that doesn't quite work, especially for books that aren't, well, 1, they don't have a magic system, or 2, they aren't fantasy, and so there isn't really a magic system to work from. And so I decided to change that. I'd been thinking and trying to figure out a good term for that, and so eventually I heard the term uniqueness factor, and I figured, you know what, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It very much ties into the world/setting, but it's a very different aspect of it. It's its own thing. It's what makes the world unique from all the other worlds. And I've done a whole series of videos on my 5 elements of story, so there's a playlist that I'll link up in the cards there as well. But these 5 elements, I usually, especially if I'm analyzing a book or a series, that's what I'll go through. I'll take each of those 5 elements and break it down, break the story down, break the series down, whatever it is, by those 5 elements, and then discuss it and see what my thoughts are. That also is how our rating system works, which I've got a rating system video for you linked up in the cards too, and that should be 4 or 5 of the cards, so hopefully there's no more to talk about. But I take these 5 elements and look at a book through this lens, and I realized as I was writing this review that there really isn't a single one of these elements that is poorly done in this book, and it's not necessarily rare, but it's rare that all 5 of them are done as good as they are in this book. The characters, the journey that they go on, their growth, their personalities, and everything about the characters specifically works so well. You meet Aiden right at the beginning, and you meet Aiden and Calorie, and you see their personalities and their interactions with each other and their relationship to each other, and you see how much that means to them, and then you see the how they respond to their village and everything, and it gives you such a good sense of their characters, and then you take that and develop it throughout the rest of the book. As for plot lines, there's also really several different plot lines, but the main plot line is about Aiden growing up and dealing with the trauma of his childhood. And the trauma that I'm referring to is a little bit of a spoiler, so I won't tell you what it is, but the way that it's dealt with, it's very well executed. The various side plots as well that lead and tie into this story work really well. So it's strange, but also really cool how Jonathan Renshaw was able to weave these various different storylines into this main storyline of Aiden growing up and dealing with his trauma, because that's the main storyline. So all these things weave together and tie into this endpoint where there's really two endpoints actually. There's the one that's right before that's like right at the, I don't know, it's not really I guess it's the peak of the action, and then there's falling action, and there's another endpoint for those storylines in the middle of that, or right at the end of the book. So there's kind of these two endpoints of the story plot, but all the different storylines tie together to those two specific endpoints. The themes of this book are also very good. There are a lot of very Christian themes, very heavily Christian themes, but they're not really blatant like Narnia. So Narnia is very obvious that it's allegorical for Jesus Christ, for his death and resurrection, for his salvation of mankind. There's a lot of very blatant allegories within Narnia. That's not how this book is, and it really helps the story along in many ways. There are several major themes though. There is dealing with trauma that I already mentioned, but there's also themes of family and friendship, righteous anger, and many, many more, all leading Aiden towards a very important decision. I was actually asked on the Discord server, and I didn't have this written down because I wrote this review before I had been asked this question on our Discord server, but it's a question that I do want to talk about, because so the question was from A.R. Witham, who is the author of, I believe it's called The Legend of Blackjack, which is a self-published book that sounds really good, and I want to read it, but I haven't yet. Anyways, so he asked the question, what makes this a Christian book? Is it allegorical like Narnia, or more literal like Left Behind, or something else? And so I had to really sit and think about that question, because it's like neither. And so my response was, it's actually not extremely Christian like either Narnia or Left Behind. What makes it Christian comes mostly from the fact that the author is Christian. So Jonathan Renshaw is a Christian, so that his worldview feeds into the way that he writes his story. There's also quite a bit of Christian theming, so forgiveness and letting go of your past sins is a big one, and it also made pretty blatant that there is a creator God, very similar to the God of the Bible. In fact, you could say it is the same God as the God of the Bible that is used in this book, which of course, Jonathan Renshaw being a Christian, that makes sense. Overall, it's pretty light on having things that a lot of people would instantly notice as Christian. So that's what I had to say in response to that question. And then Kate added to it and said that it's following a character that isn't Christian or a follower of the creator, but through the story and the things he learns, he comes to the point where he recognizes that there's something bigger than himself, a arguably subtle meet God moment. That being said, it's not a preachy story or a very spiritual focused story either. It's a fictional story written with themes that reflect God's goodness and forgiveness, and can hopefully influence readers from all backgrounds and beliefs, or at least cause them to consider these Christian themes that are so clearly portrayed. So that's what our response was to that question of what makes this a Christian book. It very much has to do with the themes, but it's not allegory, and it's not exactly literal in that same way. So getting back into the review here, so the world that is created feels very real, very lived in, but also terrifying in many places, as well as peaceful and lovely. So and you find this with a lot of fantasy worlds. You find that there's, Lord of the Rings is a great example. You start out in the Shire, and it's gorgeous, it's so lovely, it's peaceful, it's perfect, this is where you want to live. And then you go out into the world, you get into the Old Forest, and it becomes dangerous. You get into the Mines of Moria, and it's dead. Like, if you make a wrong step, if you make the wrong decision, you could die in the Mines of Moria. It's things like that where there's a natural beauty to this world. Even in the Mines of Moria, it's gorgeous, but it's also dangerous, and there's a lot of that built into this world in that same way. It is very easily envisioned, and would be great for an answer to one of those which fantasy world would you want to live in questions, because it really is absolutely gorgeous. The magic system doesn't play a massive role, but it definitely is there and leads to some very cool sequences. It's really hard to explain the magic system because this this book doesn't really start out with a magic system in that same way. It has something of magic system, and you can tell that there will be more magic that happens in later series, but right now there's not, and that's very interesting in the way that it's done. Then of course there's Renshaw's writing. So one of the things that I remember the most about reading this for the first time was how immersive it was, how much I remembered the details of the world and could envision the details of the world. It's super easy to follow and very immersive the writing is, and that really just helps you envision the world so much more clearly. Like I mentioned, my first read of this book, I went through and I read the whole book and I was like, wow, that was a really good book. But then as I distanced myself from the book, I had these images in my mind of events that happened in the book, events that you see characters go through or see in the story, and I have such a clear image of those pictures in my mind that that's what I remembered most from this book. Besides the fact that I loved the story, there was things that I could just visually see so clearly in my mind. The second reread really just reinforced that, and it's one of the most clear worlds in my imagination. So I think probably Middle-earth is the most clear world that I have, but that's partly because I've read it so many times, and Tolkien uses a ton of description to describe the world to make you see how the characters are feeling in the world, which then helps you imagine the world so much more clearly. So there's Lord of the Rings is probably my most clear world. This might very well be my second most clear world, and I've read the book twice, and most of that comes from that first reread, or that first read, I mean. Overall, this book isn't perfect. There are some issues with it. There's some strange POV switches a little bit at some points. It's not jarring ever, but as a writer, as someone who studies the writing of an author or of the best practices for how to write, you will notice probably some issues with the book. So there are some issues. That's just the one that comes to my mind most immediately, but it's not a perfect book, but it is really, really good. It's easily a 5-star read for me, and definitely a book I want others to read. Angie the Bookaholic, she has a great review for this book on her channel. She did the read along with us back in June, I think it was, and so she did a review of it all. I think I've got one more tag left, and that's a perfect one to end it on. I will have her review linked up in the channel, up in the cards up above, getting to where I can't talk anymore. She read the book with us, and seeing her thoughts were very, very cool for me, because she comes from a very different background. Just the fact that she's in India and not in the United States, that's a very different outlook on life than what I have. So seeing somebody else's thoughts on the book is really cool to me. Overall, to end this review, I really definitely recommend this book as just a great read. If you want to read self-published, if you want to support self-published authors, it's a great read. If you want a clean book for families that has very strong Christian themes in it, I recommend this book. There's so many reasons to recommend it. It's just a really, really good book. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite adventure. Hopefully this video wasn't too long, but I had a lot to say about this book. This is a book that I feel very strongly about and very happy to have reread. So we post videos every Monday and Thursday. We have our social medias linked in the description down below. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.